Who has been here before? All right, who is this the first time you've been here? Awesome, right? Aside from my friend from Idaho, is Fond du Lac the farthest somebody's come? Anybody farther than Fond du Lac? Yeah, I'm very humbled by that trip and that flight, right? So for those of you who weren't here before, if you go on our website, Randy back there is filming this, and he has put the YouTube videos up of the other two presentations. So you can actually watch them. They're a little unnerving for me because I thought it would just be my voice and the PowerPoints, but no, it's me, and then the PowerPoint flashes up, and then it goes back to me. So he's very fancy pants in the editing. So you get to see me too. Yeah, but this is me. I'm saying a lot. You have to excuse me. I like getting in my groove. I have been here at MIWRC now 4 years. The beginning of March was the beginning of my tenure here, so it's kind of crazy to think I've been here 4 years. Prior to that, I was the executive director down at Division of Indian Work. And prior to that, I mostly did legal work as an ICWA attorney. So I did that in Hennepin County courts, tribal courts, Wisconsin, actually nationwide. That's why I was in Alaska, actually. I was doing a training on ICWA. But I've been here in the Twin Cities area since '95 and around the community since easily 2001. And there's people on staff here, the agency, who knew me even way back when. In 2001. MIWRC here, this is our mission, is to empower families. I would like, if everyone would take at least a moment to send some positive energy, prayers, whatever you call it, towards our relatives at Little Earth, who are really reeling from the violence that occurred last night, that's impacted everyone who's connected to the community, which is all of us. And though the news report, no life, no one died, there was significant harm to those who were harmed. So it was certainly not life-ending, but life-changing injuries that occurred. So please keep all those families in your hearts and minds, because we need that area to succeed and those families to do better and to be safe. So here at MIWRC, we also have housing. The top 2 floors here are Section 8 special voucher families. So 2 and 3 bedrooms, pretty long-term housing. And I think the last time I checked, we're about a 2 to 3 year waiting period for our units. But we do have successes where people get through school or get new careers and decide to move off to the suburbs. And we lose them, but then we gain access for another family. So the Library and Training Center, which is sponsoring this, it's the oldest program. They've been around since 1985, doing trainings throughout the community, mostly with non-native providers in the beginning, because they were the ones working with our families to teach them how to do it and to do it well. And now they do a whole spectrum of trainings across the state in both tribal communities and urban. So I'm sure there are information and training schedules out there. And then we have kind of our direct service kind of programs. It's really grounded, and you can see the stuff we do, but I look at it more as we just try to address the harms caused by colonization. So loss of land, loss of identity, loss of language, the kind of trauma that's occurred, multi-generational, those are all things that we are always trying to expand around our programming and services. And right now, too, we do a lot more mental health work and mind-body medicine work. So really kind of trying to connect the spirit to the overall holistic health. And of course, we're in the process of absorbing the programming that went on at Kateri. So to give you a little update on that, in case you haven't heard through the grapevines, St. Stephen's has responded a couple weeks ago finally to let me know that the property has been appraised at $550,000, which is good. And now we need to start negotiations on what they're going to sell me the property for. So I'll have to raise a little more money to kind of cover that cost in addition to the kind of keep and improvements to the house that we want to make. But they say that all the families will be housed by the end of June, which is great, because then come July, we can focus on the property and then get it ready and hopefully reopen in the fall with a whole new program, new housing, the asbestos out, the lead painting out, a child care center in the basement, stuff like that. So yeah, if you know anyone with a lot of money, if you want to send them my way, that would be awesome. I need upfront money so that we can continue it later with the already wealth of funding we have here, but I need upfront. So there's my little plug for money. We have curriculum. This is all on our website, and some research. Shattered Hearts, 10 years ago that was published, which is crazy. I was just realizing that's when I met Suzanne Keplinger, who was the previous ED, was about 10 years ago in Alaska when she presented on that report up at the ICWA conference going on then. So we also did the early intervention showing, I believe, a $32 to 1 savings if you do upfront services rather than waiting after individuals get caught up in trafficking and violence and the foster care system and child protection and all of that. That helped get Safe Harbor passed because legislators understand $34 to 1, even if they don't understand the nuances around criminal sexual exploitation and that 16-year-olds can't give consent and all these things they don't like to think about, but they do understand they'll save money if they put it on the front end. And of course, we also have a parenting curriculum that's going on right now. It's grounded in strengths, both for parents and children, but recognizes that a lot of those parenting now didn't necessarily have healthy childhoods themselves and have effects of that. And then we have children who are heavily impacted with the foster care system, and so they may have been in and out of foster care. So it recognizes that, but builds it up rather than a weakness-based kind of mentality of how you get better. This is, you already have it all in you, strength-focused, but to improve, and to have kind of resources if you're struggling with behaviors. But this is why you're here tonight, right? And for those of you who have been here before, we are going to do a quick little, but we'll be quick. I promise, quick. And if you want to get more food, please do. If you want to go to the bathroom, you're grown-ups, right? You don't need to raise your hand or ask my permission. Just take care of your own needs. But it's really important if you're going to work with a community, understand the community, if it's the shooting that happened at Little Earth, if it's the trafficking that's going on, if it's opioid addiction, if it's any of those kind of targeted problems that people kind of zoom in on, how do we fix? You really can't even start figuring out solutions if you don't know and appreciate how the history has impacted the current experience. It is grounded in it, and it's not an instance of where we can just get over it. We hear that all the time, right? Or the battle of the traumas, which is an interesting phenomena that you'll see where you'll come in contact with someone and they will feel compelled to share their trauma too, I think to connect, even though that's really not necessary. Or, I was in a talk yesterday, and we all know you run into someone, they'll tell you about their great relative that was an Indian princess or an Indian, that somehow that makes this connection. But that is kind of a superficial history. And so we want to talk about what is the deeply embedded history within our community. And many people don't understand it, both from the community and out. I learn new things every day. Whether I'm working in the community, working with the people who work here, or researching to do another presentation, I learn something new, which is what life is about, right? And so community members, agencies, a lot of us continue along this work without truly understanding what's going on, and we're relying on a history that's not accurate. Much of what's taught in school is not true, or it's kind of shifted. There are some textbooks now that are reporting that tribes left to make room for the settlers, and that's summarizing genocide and the Trail of Tears and the removals and everything as this one sentence. Welcome, let us get out of your way, right? Which really is not what happened. But people who learn that history, I can't really even fault them, because you should be able to rely what you're taught in schools and school systems. But the other thing that's really important to understand for Indigenous communities is time is not, well, as you learned today, time is not necessarily a straight linear line of a beginning, middle, end, or now, past, present. It's more of a kind of circling pool that's constantly revolving around. And so the history is a current present experience for many of us. So when we speak of the history, it's something that's going on now, or our history is actually not that long ago, or it's a long time ago, but it's felt now. So when you're working in systems that are very linear, like for funding, right, how long is the program going to last? Right? Well, so in 18 months, you can take someone from this point and solve their problems and put them on, that's really not how life works, right? But you've got to understand that. And specifically for this talk, right, we're speaking and focusing on the fact that the high levels of sexual violence that occur in the community, particularly with Native women, is deeply embedded in the past experience context of how Indian women were viewed. And that has carried on and just, instead of growing, it's just compounded on top of each other so that we have situations now where you see an individual in a bikini top and a headdress going to a music festival and only a few people say no. And then people are like, what's wrong? What's the big deal? We're honoring your culture, but it's beautiful, I want to wear it, it's art. It's not understanding the whole context of that, right? But I think I make the most impact when I'm in communities and work groups and legislators and testifying and all these things with those from outside the community. When I put it in context this way, I don't know a single person within my community who hasn't been directly impacted by violence, myself included. Not one single person. So the stats may tell you one thing, but the reality is it's an everyday experience for many people. The other thing that many don't understand is how this has had a compounding effect is when I'm in community, I can look around the room and think to myself, yeah, her sister went missing last year, her sister was murdered, her cousin. Like, it's a multiple people experience, which is not outside. Very rarely do communities come together and they can count the number of people who are missing relatives, who have lost relatives to violence in 2, 3, 4 hands. So that also kind of gives you an idea of how this experience has normalized violence in a way in the communities too, which has led to more invisibilizing of it. So people aren't up and around, another shooting at Little Earth is kind of the tone you hear, right? If 6 people were shot in Edina over a family fight or whatever, it would be reported in a slightly different way. And the reporting would continue. We even see that in reporting of missing, right? With Drew Shadeen, when she disappeared out of Fargo, it hit the news. There were people went crazy trying to find her. And unfortunately, she had been murdered. There was another instance where a Native woman disappeared in Fargo, and really only community members knew about Miss Graywin. Only we heard about it through Facebook, and it wasn't until her baby was found and she was found murdered that it hit. But there weren't big search parties for her. There wasn't a lot of Time News reports going on. And so that effect, this multi-generational historical attitude towards Native women has a modern effect in the way that woman's disappearance and subsequent murder was reported and understood, right? And it's something where it gets tiring. It gets tiring, people. I'll just tell you that. So we've covered quite a bit so far for those of you who haven't been here. And for those of you who have, woohoo, way to hang in there. But today we're going to cut, my earrings caught on my thing again. It's a girl. We got up through boarding schools last time, which is a very painful, harsh experience for many. And so now we're going to move into the Indian Reorganization Act termination policy, which also includes the child welfare system. So we're going to talk a little bit too today about how we got into the Indian Child Welfare Act and kind of Indian child services now. Because there's also an impact on how we see Native women and their ability to parent, or the community at large, which has also had an immediate, very intense effect on our children now, which is why Minnesota has the highest out-of-home placement rate in the nation, 16 times more likely to be removed if you're Native than if you are any other race. That is at the levels of the 70s before we had federal law trying to prevent it. So that history has an effect in the modern day. So we're only going to cover about 100 years in 30 slides, right? We covered like 300 years the first day. So piece of cake. Piece of cake. Quick recap. When colonists came here, their first view of Native women were highly sexualized, uncivilized, sinful beings. Because as we talked before, when the Puritan view and the kind of Christian mindset of women, they were property, they were home, they took care of the kids, prepared food, and they were affronted by the egalitarian society that existed in most of the tribal communities, where women may have very specific roles, but they weren't seen as less than or property of any male. In fact, in most of them, women owned the property. So if I could decide to get divorced, I would kick my husband out of my home. I get to keep everything. He would go live with his parents, and then I would maybe remarry, maybe not. He'd have to find another woman and live with her in their home somewhere else. Right? That conflicted intensely with those first contact, right? And it proved to them, too, the need for this manifest destiny of spreading their belief system and their religion, too, because we need to rescue the sinful behavior, right? Especially because sex back then, too, some of the tribes, it was used to, oops, see my earrings, I'm a mover. I might have to take them off. But I love them. Oftentimes it was used to smooth over trade, right? Because there was no judgment based on the behavior. It was just behavior. So consent was there, but when the colonizers came too, they assumed consent at all times. So in the early days, there was no such thing to them as raping Native women because Native women were always in a perpetual state of consent. And we went through some of the readings that were kind of shocking in the class. You can look that up on YouTube, right? When we moved in kind of the removal era, which was in the mid-1800s into the 1860s, 70s, it shifted from this kind of highly sexualized whore, quite frankly, to dangerous, violent. And that these, as breeders, they were threatening the progress of civilization. They were preventing it. And so when you look at the kind of newspapers and writings of that time, the reports are that women were even worse than the men who were at war with the United States by now. And so we see this effect of dehumanizing any community is a tool for conquest, right? This goes back millennia. Right? Roman conquests, right? You hear about it in other parts of the world, and even now in some segments of the world. This idea of they're not quite human, so it doesn't really matter what I do to them because they're not like me. Makes it easier to kind of not adopt the horror, the trauma that you're committing. And so when tribal women and the communities were moved into reservations, they continued this kind of attitude of dangerous and uncivilizing, which also meant when there was pretty intense violence committed by the cavalry or by settlers or farmers against the tribes, the women, elders, and women, or children, there was no outrage. In fact, they'd report it in the news. There were, we spoke about how the writer of Wizard of Oz, Frank Baum, had a 3-part series in the Rapid City newspaper asking for the complete termination of the Dakota, Lakota, everyone in the Dakotas and Montana, because they were a hindrance to civilization, right? And it was published in the news. That was just common beliefs at the time. Okay, right? Again, no outrage because people saw the indigenous people as not people. They were more close to animals. However, after the Civil War, there was a shift. Because when Lincoln freed the slaves, right? Most of them weren't really freed, right? But the great emancipator, those who went out into the community did not revert back to African tribal identity because they didn't know what it was. It had been hundreds of years since they'd been exposed to their indigenous ways. And so they modeled their owners. They went to church on Sundays. They sent their kids to school. They farmed, right? Some had businesses. And people looked at the freed slaves and thought, wow, look how great they're doing. And then looked at the tribal people in the reservations where people were starving, there was disease, there was violence, and thought, oh, wow, we should have enslaved the tribes. That would have helped to civilize them. We made a mistake, and now, darn it, it's illegal to enslave people because of that stupid 14th Amendment, right? So now we're going to do this intense level of assimilation. We're going to kind of force people to become the civilized people. And so destroying this last kind of venture of the woman being kind of the head of the household, in fact, managing the household, the Allotment Act, which not only broke up land, it also only gave land to the male head of household. And this was at the late 1800s. So we've now hit a point where this egalitarian kind of environment, despite constant onslaught, the only way to take a benefit from land and citizenship, actually at this point, is for the men to behave as the male heads of household and the women to be right? To be under. Because at this point, women can't own a thing. I mean, we didn't have the right to own things for many years, right? And so it forced women to behave like Europeans, and it forced the men to also behave like Europeans. So I don't know that we do enough kind of conversations and discussions about, for our males and our men in our communities, what it means to be an indigenous man before colonization, when there was more of an egalitarian society. And less about honoring women and more about how are we equals, how are we sharing roles of responsibilities, instead of kind of putting women up on a pedestal like they're, an angel up in the sky, right? That's also not healthy and not how it was according to research early on. Boarding schools, right? I won't get into this. Please read on YouTube. It's triggering and traumatizing. The one thing I like to show this picture for is because many who haven't heard me talk before, heard this before, is all of these children were actually, their parents fought at the Battle of Bighorn, right, or Greasy Grass. And so Congress only gave one condition to this first boarding school, was that Captain Carlisle, who opened it, takes the children from the Dakotas and the plains and puts them here because they hoped that would end the Indian Wars. And it succeeded. I mean, that's what collapsed the last fight, because they took the children away. But, so that was, about 400 years in 15 minutes. So, now we're in Indian reorganization. Now we're in the 1900s. So we've gone through a period now of allotment, where segments of land were broken up, the tribal lands, and given to individual Indians to farm and to assimilate. Well, it didn't go so well, the whole allotment era. In 1928, a Miriam Report was published. It was funded by Rockefeller, so it wouldn't be biased. And it looked at around 26 states, I believe, that had high concentrations of individuals who were participating in allotment, essentially to report on what a wonderful program it was. That was the goal. So they looked at a lot of different areas: health, education, employment, and specifically they looked at women. And it gives a very clear picture of how Native women were viewed in the early 1900s. They're very clear. And you can Google Miriam Report and read it. It's accessible, open it, read it on the internet. But yeah, they noted particularly how idle women were in the tribes, that they weren't really good homeworkers, that they needed help with the whole housewiving thing. And that, I love this, essential household arts. I guess that makes doing dishes feel better, right, if I call it an art form? I don't think I buy that. But that it was undeveloped. And I've talked to people whose grandparents were at this time, they're like, oh, that's why my grandma went to school to be a housewife. Like they had special classes to help show Native women how they should be housewifing and to teach them, right? She said there's a whole series, she'd seen pictures of Native women in like the garb of the housewife of the 20s being taught with ovens and being cared for that way, right? Also that their proper preparation of food or care of the youth was completely understood or misunderstood in the tribes. They didn't know how to make food, cook food, feed their families, and they certainly didn't know how to care for babies. Now, put this into context too, right? This is shortly after states have passed a number of laws making it illegal for children to be used as labor. So there's also an intensity right now focused on what a well-being of a child is that will morph into best interests that we deal with even now. But at this time, the idea of a cradle board was seen as neglect. Why would you put a baby in a board and put it against the wall? Right? Again, and we see that years and years later, and even today, right? When we had childcare here, we weren't allowed to use traditional swings because they were unsafe and would jeopardize our license to do childcare. So children have been in sweat, you know. I should have been taken away so many times from my parents just on that alone. Their inability to do income, right? That money didn't have the same kind of value. They couldn't save money, they couldn't spend money, they couldn't budget for money. And that as the woman, that was their role. And that there is just no leadership at all. Now, 50 years before, women were leaders in the tribe. Right? Even before that, right? If you were here, you saw the picture of the individual who jumped into the battle of Greasy Grass or Bighorn and fought along her brother, right? Certainly a very strong leader. But this is, again, an outsider looking in. So the Miriam Report also noted the boarding schools. I'll just point out, they said they were an absolute dismal failure. And even noted at that time the abuse that was going on in those schools. But despite state laws preventing it, it was a federal school, and so state law doesn't apply in those federal systems. In fact, there weren't like federal child protection type laws until the 70s and 80s. And so in 1928, in response to the Miriam Report, Congress took the recommendations out of that report and passed the Indian Reorganization Act. Now, the IRA took tribes from a point where they were no longer recognized as governments. Our religion and ceremony are still banned at this point. All the lands had been taken away and broken up and either sold to private individuals or given to individual Indians. And then they shifted 180 degrees, re-recognized tribal governments, gave back land that wasn't already sold off or lost to state forfeiture, and gave them back government. Now, the interesting thing about the IRA, though, is it's very similar. Oh, yeah, I guess it's time. It gets too hot in here with the lights, people. Is at the time, tribes had different forms of government, right? Consensus is very common. There might have been a council, a panel, right? There might have been one group doing basically everything, right? Making kind of the law, enforcing community norms, making judgment when those norms are violated. But long-lasting government, which was here even before first contact. What the IRA did is it took the United States Constitution and the three-tiered form of government and dumped it on tribes. Now, the Iroquois, that's where that came from. So some tribes already operated in this. Most did not. And so it gave them this very uncomfortable glove for their government, and it had a lot of oversight. The attitude towards Indians at this point is pretty much like children, like toddlers. Like, we're going to give you government, but just like you let your toddler think they're walking around by themselves, but yeah, as soon as they're ready to stick the fork in the light, you are there grabbing them, right? Even if they didn't know you, we're there. The same with the government. So everything had to be approved by the government. Everything. Any change to anything, you had to go through DC and get secretarial approval. In fact, it wasn't until the 90s that tribes could hire an attorney without the secretary's approval. You had to go through a background check at a federal level and get the approval of the Bureau of Indian Affairs before you could start working for a tribe as an attorney. Right? The 90s is when that ended. But it was this kind of, paternalistic attitude, which is really how they were feeling towards tribes as general, is, we're children, they're dependent on us, we need to take care of them, but not doing a very good job. I kind of tongue-in-cheek joke that if there's child protection in this kind of area, the federal government would have been pulled into court a long time ago. And the other thing that the Reorganization Act did is no more allotment of land, so reservations kicked back in. So the land base that was slowly going away from private individuals either buying it, or what more likely happened is an individual Indian would get the land but not be successful in making it sustainable and not being able to pay taxes and things after the 25-year trust expired, the state would reclaim the land in forfeiture. And so a lot of land was lost from the 1900s to the 1930s. But now land is indefinitely put into trust. This is why, too, we talked about in the first class, but I'll remind you, it's called trust land. Tribes don't own their land. That's why we can game on tribal trust land, because there is no federal law against gaming. There are state laws against gaming. So no matter how long they leave that space open between the Mall of America and IKEA, in hopes of someday putting a casino there, they're going to have to change state law in order to do it, because that is never going to be federal tribal trust land. And that's what it needs to do. No matter whether they have a MOU with the tribe, the way the land is what gives it that kind of authority. This is also, this reorganization did another thing, is, remember how we talked about last time, about allotment, and that's where quantum came from, blood quantum. Quarter, being Indian enough, right? The IRA also embedded that criteria into their constitution. So in order to be an enrolled member of the tribes under the IRA, you had to have a quarter Indian blood in you for that purpose. Now, remember, 30 years earlier, when they were talking about quantum, they were talking about it because they knew within 3 to 4 generations, they didn't think any of us would be around anymore. So even under the IRA, there was no intentionality or even thought in their head that there would still be tribes and tribal people in 2018. No way. They had no idea. Right? But tribes now still fight over that quantum. Right? That is usually the issue that raises the most tension and hostility, is changing from quantum into descendancy, or shifting from a quarter to an eighth, or whatever, right? But dogs, tribes, and horses are the only living things that have to prove a certain level of quantumness in order to be identified as that species. No one else has to do that. So how are we looking at Native women at the time? Well, Native women have been in a position of egalitarian and kind of control of all the resources to being under the control of the head of household, which is the male of the family. And they're now being told, you are horrible housewives, horrible parents, horrible feeders, right? Undermining absolutely anything that's left. But out in dominant society, this is when we start to see kind of a highly sexualized image of Native women as produced by other people. So we're moving now from being real, living, breathing entities into a historical kind of artistic context where you have a lot of freedom. So you can tell all of these women, right? Well, they're always by water, right? Always by water. Headdresses, right? Which for those tribes, not that many use headdresses, actually. It's pretty much a plains thing, right? You go down to the Navajo, there are no feather headdresses. They have different things. And they're solely worn by men. And each feather is earned. Right? I think an individual in World War II was the last individual to earn a headdress because he participated in the war. Right? And things like touching your enemy without killing them is one, stealing a horse is one. Like there's very specific things that an individual does in order to earn the headdress. But also at this point, the ceremonial kind of aspect of it is still illegal too, right? Because Native people are not allowed to do ceremony of any sort from the late 1800s until the 70s when we got our Freedom of Religion Act. So this is happening in the dominant culture, whereas we're not necessarily able to use any of these items ourselves. Which is also adds the additional layer when sports teams will say things like, well, we have history with this, the tomahawk, we've been using the tomahawk chalk for 60, 70, 80, 100 years. It's likely they were able to do it when the tribes themselves were not. Again, which dehumanizes the people that those items are connected to, right? But you can see also highly sexualized, always alone, usually looking off, right? Kind of a stylized, romanticized version of Native women. We also start to see there's this movement around burlesque. You know, there's kind of a re-movement, like there's burlesque going on now. But it goes all the way back to these 30s and 40s, you know, where there was this kind of genre of strip dancing that was kind of teasing, and it was seen as an art form. Well, many of them also took on kind of Native imagery when they did their dancing. None of these women are Native either. And I'll point out, like I said before, things that are ceremonial to us are used as props. So this individual woman is holding a pipe, a peace pipe, right? This one has a drum. She also has a pipe. Now, you don't just buy a pipe, right? I mean, to be a pipe carrier, you don't just go to the store, pick up a pipe, and suddenly you're a pipe carrier, right? There is a ceremony around that. At the time these ladies are holding these items, it was illegal for Native people to hold them themselves. Again, highly sexualized though, you know, caricatures, cartoons almost, certainly not real. And you probably can't see from out there, but even the dog has on a headdress feather, right? I think it's not a basset, a beagle. The beagle, right? So, after relocation, the Reorganization Act, we've got tribal governments now. We're supposed to be having business development, right? Tribes, there's Buy Indian Acts going on, kind of encouraging it. Trying to build up this government that is male now at this point too, right? I mean, the governments all over are male in the 50s. Well, another thing occurred. We moved into a termination era. And what happened is after World War II, it's kind of interesting, right? I mean, we fought against the Nazis in World War II, right? And people believed in individual freedoms, right? Civil rights. All this stuff kind of bubbling up. But when people looked at the way the federal government was treating the tribes, and this deep oversight, this permissive for everything, this kind of quality of children and government, They're like, looks a lot like, I don't know, fascism. And I mean, this makes us uncomfortable because this is apparently what we were fighting against in the war, and it's going on here. So now, instead of just a general Indian problem over land and poverty and reservations and resources, now the United States kind of has a PR problem. Because, again, people heard and have seen globally how the United States has treated tribes. They've read the Miriam Report, they've seen even the government, and they're like, you're not so good with treating the people that live in your own borders, so why are you bothering us? Right? Isn't that funny? We hear that now, right? Mind your own business. You're not even doing good there. And so Congress responded with termination, which is the most extreme response, right? So they terminated about 118 tribes overnight. So they went from federal recognized governments within the United States to being nothing but United States citizens, lost all their land, lost their recognition, lost their rights to health services or anything else that was being provided. And what's interesting, though, I will caution everyone now who what then is then and now is now, is when we listen to Congress now talk about things such as freeing tribes from bureaucratic burdens and allowing tribes more freedom to have economic opportunities in their own lands, and we feel that the government is too burdensome and intrusive in tribal government and tribal lives. Those are the exact same verbatim reasons that they terminated tribes in the 50s. And we're hearing it now coming out of Congress. So tribes, those of us paying attention, are worried we're about to enter into another termination era from the federal government. Especially when we hear things that the executive branch, that's all I'm going to say of that, is calling tribes racial and a racial-based classification rather than political. We've had political status recognized for a long time, but to call us racial means that the special relationship between the federal government and the tribes could end. So in this termination era, right, are 109 tribes. I misspoke, I'm sorry. 109 tribes, 2.5 million acres were lost. The Klamath National Forest, anybody been there? Up in the Pacific Northwest, right? It's beautiful, right? Those are the Klamath tribal lands. But the federal government wanted them, and so they terminated them. So the Klamath tribe was terminated. Their land was converted into federal forest land. They cut a lot of that forestry down. And now it's a small token has gone back to the tribe with re-recognition, but they did not gain all their acres back at all. Oh, yeah, the Japanese American internments also took place up there. Yes. So the Japanese internment, one of the camps was located in the Klamath Forest lands, which were tribal lands, right? Because they're federal lands now. 12,000 lost tribal affiliation. The Menominee Nation over in Wisconsin is the closest one who went through termination. They were reinstated, which is also why over in Wisconsin, in the middle of the state, the county of Menominee is actually the Menominee Nation, and it's only federal and tribal jurisdiction. No state jurisdiction there, right? Like 80-some% of the residents are native, right? Not necessarily Menominee, but native. So there's no state jurisdiction in that little circle, because that was the deal they made when they came back in. But ultimately what this does is erase native people, right? Which, based on what we saw here, most of the general population didn't really think there were that many native people around anyway. And even just, 40 years before that, the federal government thought we'd be gone in 3 to 4 generations too, right? So from that perspective, which has been ongoing until very recently, it makes sense that they would go into termination and start planning for what we're going to do with the land when there aren't any more Indians left anyway, right? They just kind of sped it up. Now, the termination era did not continue, which is good. Who can tell me who stopped termination policies? Nixon. Yeah, Watergate, I know, right? That's just white people spying on each other, right? I mean, meh. But Nixon saw termination as destructive. And I think from a business perspective, I've never found anywhere where he's written about it, but it strikes me as very interesting politically that more conservative, fiscally kind of focused governments tend to be more supportive of tribal sovereignty. And more liberal, socially minded governments tear apart tribal sovereignty. It's a weird kind of dichotomy that's gone on, but when you look at the kind of the arc of the United States and the different presidents and political spheres, generally, I don't think this current one is a good example, but currently tribes usually do better in conservative Congress and presidents. That could be. That would make sense, that he knew people that affected him personally, right? That could be. The other thing that with termination here, remember way back when, in the Marshall Trilogy when we talked about it, why did Justice Marshall fine for the tribes? Do you remember, anybody who was here, why did he support the tribal idea of state rights don't apply or state law, tribes are quasi-sovereign, but they have a relationship with the federal government? Right? And he was a strict federalist, and he knew if the tribes were in existence and the federal government had a relationship with the tribes, wherever the tribes were amongst the states, the feds had a foot. Same here, right? If they truly terminate all the tribes, then the federal presence in the same way is going to end in many of the states. And then we will have another state right, federal right kind of more intense struggle than we do now, right? But for Native people, right, termination, erasure. And the other thing that happened in this era is we got a Supreme Court decision from Menominee, bless their hearts. It's my favorite people are Menominee. They argued and successfully won that their treaty rights were not terminated when their recognition as a government was. That the treaty rights predate the United States because they're inherent rights. And so unless Congress clearly terminated those, they still exist. So even though they were a terminated tribe, they maintained all their hunting, fishing, and gathering rights on their lands. The problem with that is in a modern context now. If Congress decides to terminate tribes, they know how to do it right. They will terminate the treaties, they will terminate all the rights, and they have the ability to do that, which would lead to the complete erasure of government structure. It will always be here, right? But the independence of the different tribal nations will be absolved. Now, Public Law 280 exists here. And this is also, kind of wrapped up within termination is also that tribal government just failed. Indians just weren't doing it right. It's just best if we eliminate it, right? And so Public Law 280, which exists now, gave criminal and civil jurisdiction over tribes by state law in a handful of states, right? California, Minnesota, Nebraska, Oregon, and Wisconsin. People ask, why those states? Well, robust with resources these states are. And the minute they terminated the tribes, that land became federal, which meant they had easier access to those resources. Same with Alaska, right? Federal owned. And then later on, it was amended to include all these other states. The difference here is for the other states, it's a hybrid. Tribes were able to opt in and opt out, which is also with Red Lake there. But at this time, they figured they're going to terminate everyone someday anyway, so it didn't matter if it was partial here, partial there. Sooner or later, everyone would be terminated. And then Nixon stopped it. So we exist in this very weird jurisdictional existence, which feeds into why Native women and people who experience violence in tribal communities on reservations often go unpunished. Because states have jurisdiction in the state law, but they don't enforce. Tribes do not have jurisdiction over non-Indians, thanks to the Supreme Court and their interpretation. And the feds just don't get involved. So this is why the murder rate for Native women is 10 times what it is in off the reservation, on the reservation, right? Because we have this very weird jurisdictional gap where no one is doing the enforcement, which to me is just another example of erasure of the people if you're not paying any attention. I found these are from the 50s. A bunch of Valentine's cards, but they're all focused on Native, right? I'd never squawk if you'd be my, Valentine, referring to a squaw, which is not appropriate language to use in reference to a woman. Honest Injun, I want you for my Valentine, right? You heap fine Valentine and how. I'm hunting for you, be mine, right? Honest Injun, I like you, heap lot, right? And how about us be Valentines, not us squaw, right? So, and this 50s and 60s, right? This isn't that long ago that the attitude towards Native people were one of mockery. And I would say too, this is not mocking living individuals. This is mocking the idea of Indians. I think most people didn't even recognize that there were tribes around to even mock. They were kind of invisible in an intense way at this time because of termination and all the kind of federal stuff. So this was, again, taking imagery that's out there and creating something of it on their own. Now, the other thing that happened at this time, right, because of termination, was also the intense influence of child protection. Because if we're terminating tribes and terminating governments and terminating that kind of tribal recognition, well, what about the children? Well, it's generally best if they're raised away from Native families. And that started in the 50s. More children have been removed by child protection through the 50s, 60s, 70s, into the 80s than all of the boarding school eras combined from first contact. I'm going to say that again. More Native children have been removed from their families through social welfares in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and the beginning of the 80s than if you combine all the eras of boarding schools since first contact. And there were boarding schools, Catholic ones and Episcopal, from first contact, even before there was the United States. There were boarding schools, right? So the child protection system has actually done far more harm as far as disrupting family structure than any of the assimilation policies of the federal government. And most of these are state-driven, right? It was thousands, right? The problem, too, about child welfare for anybody in the 50s and 60s is it was all removal and adoption. There weren't reunification. That was an 80s thing, right? That's not what they did back then. Right? Bad kids went to reform school. Abused kids, if anybody paid attention, were placed with someone else or put into another school. Right? So there wasn't the same kind of robust foster care recruitment and kin recruitment. And that people didn't do that then. Right? But for Native kids, they truly believed that the best thing for them was to be raised by someone else. So we have pockets of Native Jewish people out east because adoption agencies targeted Jewish communities because of the coloring. Because a Native kid would blend in easier there than they would, obviously, with a Scandinavian family, right? If you place a Navajo child with a Swedish family in the Midwest, people are either going to look at mom funny, right? Or everybody's going to know that kid came from somewhere. So they tried in their best interest to match them with, oh, thank you, it's 5:30. See, she's keeping me on track. The other thing, I was training in Salt Lake City about 6 months ago, maybe a year. It was a year because it was spring. I remember that. And an individual came up to me from the break, and he was in his early 60s. And he wanted to share with me how excited he was. And I wasn't doing this kind of training. I was training about Self-Determination Act. Nowhere is fun. But he wanted to tell me what a wonderful experience he had growing up because he was Mormon, and one of the bishops, I think that's what you call the kind of head up, had come to his family farm and said they had a Native child that they wanted to know if they would raise. And so he got to grow up with this Navajo girl And what a blessing it was to him, right? And he was joking about, how his mom called her her little Indian, and and I sat there like I have these moments, right, where I can behave, believe me, but I was struck with just deep sadness because he didn't know where she was in the war. He said, yes, when she was in her teens, she went away, I don't know where. But I know from history that during that era, particularly in that part, Navajo children were literally kidnapped from their families, stolen and placed with farmers to save them. And so it's very likely that that child had been stolen from her family, but this individual, from his perspective, it really was a beautiful experience for him and his family to have this cultural experience. That reminds me, too, that even in my head, if I think things are really beautiful and great, I need to check and make sure. Or social workers who are working, right? Make sure. Because your perspective is always clouded by your own experience and may not be the experience of the one you're addressing. But yeah, the Indian Adoption Project itself was funded by the federal government specifically to put children with white families. So we've got a Menominee child down here, Thomas, and that's the Split Feathers blog spot. That's an ongoing website, and A Generation Removed is a document. There's also Looking for Good Feather is a book, too, about a woman that experienced being placed away from her family during this project. But that continued for a long time. And the Child Welfare League of America, they're still in existence, right? They actually were paid under a 9-year grant to partner. Again, from a best interest standpoint, because they felt that these children were, floundering in foster care because no one would take them because they were Indian, right? So it was race. Because they're brown, no one wants them. So everyone thought this was awesome, this whole program. Champion for civil rights and equality, right? So just from this period, right, you can see the attitude towards Indian women is enmeshed in there too, right? Not only are their governments and their tribals getting torn apart, but their children are getting taken away, right? And there's many indigenous communities have sayings around how do you destroy a community? Like it's collapsed when the women are on the ground, right? That's the last place. And take their children away, man, I'll kill you if you try to take my kids. I'm not kidding, right? I am dead serious, right? Which is why social workers have a very dangerous job. Self-determination started in the 60s. We went from this era of termination into civil rights, which is kind of interesting, right? We're going to eliminate you, and now we're going to give you civil rights. This is why federal Indian law, or even working in this field, is like the most schizophrenic experience ever, because there's nothing, you just have to let it go and just know that just accept, because there's no logic here. Because during the 60s, because of the civil rights movement in the South, it raised attention throughout the country. And so Congress started hearing that tribes were lawless, that individual Indians didn't have protections against their own governments. And so they kicked in and gave the Indian Civil Rights Act, which is a huge slash at tribal sovereignty, actually. Because a true sovereign can treat their people however they want, whether you like it or not, right? North Korea has a horrible history with human rights, but they're a sovereign. They get to do that, right? Same with tribes. Now the federal government's telling them how to behave. The interesting thing is, though, under the Indian Civil Rights Act, individual Indians do not have any ability to go to the federal government for help. So there's no remedy in it. So it's kind of just words on paper, quite frankly. And then in the late 60s into the 70s, the American Association for Indian Affairs started looking at Indian children removals, right? And I'm sure if you knew any ICWA work, any child protection, you've seen these. Up to 1 in 3 of all Indian children were separated, right? 25 times higher nationally than it was for Indian kids. In Wisconsin, it was 1,600 times higher than any place else. And that 85% were in foster homes of non-Indian homes, which were pre-adoptive homes into non-Native families. Right? And what was shocking is the parenting that was going on, only 1% was abuse for the removal. Everything else was social deprivation, which is a judgment call against the parenting structure that was going on. Right? So things such as grandma is raising the child, and she doesn't know where mom is right now. At this time, those were grounds for removal and termination of parental rights because mom had abandoned the child and grandma never bothered to get legal custody of the child through an American court system. Right? Never mind that in many tribal communities, extended child-rearing practices are common and, in my opinion, who relied very heavily on both sets of grandparents, a better way of child-rearing, because I and myself do not have all the lessons that my children need to be successful. They have to spend time with other relatives. Right? Things such as a woman had 3 children with 3 different men. That meant she was morally questionable and dangerous to her children, and would result in the termination. What? Or a movie. Well, but hidden, right? And not native. Right? But even the study found that the conditions for removal weren't harmful. There wasn't any harm going on. It was a social analysis of the value of the mother in the most case situations. And this all led to ICWA stuff, right? Voluntary waivers weren't really voluntary. They didn't know what they were signing. They didn't speak English. They didn't read English, right? People outright lied to them, said they were going to school when they were signing away their parental rights, right? The tribes were consulted. People were disdainful, dismissive, disgusted by Indian culture. And if you were with a grandparent or a auntie or someone, you had absolutely no protections at all. And so at the same time that our children are experiencing this, we also had a huge influx of civil rights stuff, particularly here, right? You're in the heart of AIM, right here, right? The beginnings of the Indian Child Welfare Act were written over by Indian Health Board, first draft, right? AIM itself, right up there, right? And it was all around American Indian treaty rights, protections, land rights. We had all these occupations. It's funny, I prepared this presentation for this kind of slide, and then I was at a meeting with Clyde Belcourt, and he started talking about the occupation at the BIA when he was there, right? And sitting there and deciding, okay, do we stay? Do we get arrested? What do we do? Like the ongoing debate that they had, even when they were trying to decide how firm of a stand they would take, right? But all of these happened, and many of us never learn about them, nor do we learn about the fact that there were a lot of very strong Native women at the top and front of these movements, right? All you have to do is look at the pictures. Google into these and look at the pictures, and there are women everywhere, right? A very good friend of mine who passed a little while ago, Jean Ann Day, was one of the organizers of the Longest Walk, right? The flag they carried was over her casket and then was handed off to the next surviving, right? That history is right now living with us, but we don't learn about this stuff, and that hurts our kids too. But the problem with seeing all these strong Native women is people started becoming very aware of the culture, the art, the jewelry, the clothing, and people started to appropriate it. In fact, everyone knows about Sharon Mackey, right? Bob Mackey, her headdress and her beading and her leather, right? That was taken expressly from Native people. And yes, Cher has Native blood. That doesn't mean you get to appropriate a different tribe's culture, because that's not the tribe she's from, what she's demonstrating there either, right? A Vargas pinup girl here, right? I buttoned out her boob. I didn't want to offend anyone. Valentino for Vogue. If you can see that closely, it's made of buckskin and it's heavily beaded, right? A direct copy of, and if you look at the design, right, we see that design now. I like the JCPenney ad, swimsuits for an Indian summer. Right? And then over here, Giorgio Sant'Angelo, again, Vogue 1970. I mean, this dude doesn't even know which tribe he's going after. Because if you look at it closely, there's both Native and African cultural and tribal stuff mixed in there, right? But that stuff sold for a lot of money. And it's not changed much. I mean, come on, this is just, 30 years later. You don't have to Google very far, and you see these exact same pictures. on the internet, right? The sad thing, though, is when our youth only see these pictures. Also, when you see this, right, a highly sexualized image and view of what a Native woman should be, if that's the only image you see, it again places Native women at a higher vulnerability, right? It's there's a whole fetish out there about it. Also, around views of Native women, it was okay for people to wear the attire to look Native, but if you were Native, Indian Health Services sterilized you without your permission, without your consent, and without your knowledge. One of the occupations found this information when they started digging through the BIA files, which led to investigation, first by the U.S. government, the GAO. They do all the investigation internally. That's a federal agency. They found 3,400 women had been sterilized, but an independent study found 1 in 4, many under the age of 21, and if they were full-blooded, they were expressly selected for the procedure. Right? There are women who don't know that they were in this. Right? They just think they've always had fertility problems and just never knew why, right? Unless they went to a doctor. We also have moving into the 80s, right? 80s. I graduated in 1988. Right? I'm 48 now. Atari. Who remembers Atari? Oh, yeah. I have one. My husband collects these things. Now my 15-year-old and I have more games than I need, units. Custer's Revenge was an Atari game, an X-rated one, where you played as Custer or his soldiers, whatever, cavalry, and you got extra credit if you assaulted Native women. That's how you made points in the game, right? And of course, we had the fishing wars up in Wisconsin, controversy over treaty rights, spearfishing. Many of the signs said things like, "Save our fish by spearing a pregnant squaw." You wouldn't say that about someone you thought was human, right? Not someone you saw as your wife, your sister, your daughter. Interestingly enough, the fishing protests, the controversy, the tribes and the anti-treaty people came together, actually, because of the mines, to rally together and lobby against the Crankton mine going in, because it was going to hurt their fish, right? It was going to kill the fish for all of them. But yeah, this is kind of where we are moving into next month, right, when I come back. But why does this all matter, right? Again, why does it matter? Other than to horrify you, make you feel a little sick, for those of you who never knew any of this, to sit here with this, right? Have that sit in your skin and be like, oh my, I had no idea. I hear that every single time I present on anything. I had no idea. Right, that doesn't change it, that doesn't undo it, that doesn't erase the effect that what that did has done to the community. And so it absolutely matters now, because if you don't have a respect for that kind of history, it's very easy to it's another shooting at Little Earth. What's wrong with those people? Right? That those people tone, I hear all the time. Oh, see, every time something hits me and it hits me off. Those families, our community, are not those people. We're people. And we've survived. So everybody who comes into this agency, I don't care what they're doing, they're alive and they're surviving. And that gives me hope that they will get better and the families will get better. Because as a community, we have gone through a lot of shit for multiple generations, and we're made to act like we should just get over it, right? Shake it off. Fix it, right? Well, it's very hard to heal if no one acknowledges that a harm has happened. If you're in social work, that's like social work 101. Well, I ask you, if an entire community hasn't been acknowledged the trauma, why is anyone surprised there was a shooting last night at Little Earth? Why are we surprised that there are 12 and 13 and 14-year-olds being sold? Why are we surprised that a third of all prostitution arrests on Lake are Native women, even though we're less than 2% of the population? Why is anybody surprised? The problem is no one is surprised. No one knows. The erasure and invisibilizing of the community has been so effective, it's just another form of genocide. And so, boy, this is a downer. I'm sorry. It's been a rough week. I ask you as you come here as allies that you don't own this as a guilt, right? No one is saying this is your fault, your guilt at all. But what I am saying to my allies who are out there and don't go to their convenings, their card games or their church meetings, and they don't know anyone who's been murdered, right? That if you don't hear about the indigenous experience wherever you go, ask why not. Like, start challenging people. If you don't see data in the Star Tribune, if you don't see data coming from the state, if you say every ethnic or racial group has improved in poverty, and you see no line for Native kids, ask them why. I can tell you why in that instance. It's because they're the only group that poverty got worse in the report. Is to actually take on some small thing of sharing out information, right? Know where you're at, know where you're from, know whose land you're standing on, and just respect it, right? As human beings. You'll be surprised how easy it is to kind of raise awareness of issues when you see it as human and not as those people struggling. I mean to end these so light, but man, I'm tired. Questions, comments? A high, uplifting story of happiness and joy? And excitement to come next month where we'll talk about where we go from here and what we do. What's the date? Joe, what day did we decide? We just decided today. May 31st. It's a Thursday, exactly 4 weeks away, eh? Right? Yeah, 4 weeks from today at 4 to 6, right here, right back. Anybody have a question or comment? You cry, it makes people not want to talk, Bettina. Yeah, I know.
So I'm not crazy whenever I hear on TV and they name every blessed minority, and I'm screaming at the TV going, and Native American. And so it's not just me who, and I'm Irish German. But,
no.
Okay. So that's something that I could do, just say again, and always insert that.
Yeah, where are the Indians? Absolutely.
Because it infuriates me, actually.
And call your representatives. Call whoever and say, why isn't this information here? I want to know. Right? Or even for those of us I'm Lakota. I'm not. These are not my lands. I'm a little further west. Sometimes all we see is Dakota and Ojibwe reported from the state of Minnesota. Well, I know we just met with Joe Hobart yesterday from OIC. 34 different tribal nations were represented last year in the students and people they worked with at their agency, right? Here in they're literally 6 blocks away from here, right? So it's not just the 11 sovereign nations here. There are 573 federally recognized tribes, and many of them are represented in Minneapolis in some numbers. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
I'm interested in the missing and murdered women, and I know that there was some legislation that was in the works about trying to get a special task force to look at that issue with some money attached to it.
Yes.
Do you know what the status of that is?
The Representative Mary Kunish Podine, along with Jamie and Peggy and Susan, right, the whole Native Women Caucus over there, they did put forth legislation. It's had bipartisan support. I haven't, so far as I know, it's still going, but I don't believe it's had a final, like it's in the public safety bill, and there's other things in the public safety bill that are, that's where the gun stuff is, people, right? I mean, so it's enmeshed in there. I'm hopeful that it'll still get passed, because the task force that the Minnesota is looking at creating will look at the issue of missing, murdered Indigenous women and girls, though we all understand that will include men and boys just by as we collect data. But it'll create a task force of multiple experts to look at how do we report, how do we identify, how do we address the underlying causes, effects, and how do we impact policy, how do we impact law enforcement, because they don't track the race of the victims. For the most part, not consistently. They will the perpetrator, but not the victim. Yes, and then yes. Oh. And there's someone in the back when she's done.
I'm a social work graduate student, and I will be working for a county being in Fort E. And so I guess I'm wondering if if there's been any work done with working, if the county has been open to working with tribes and looking at, the tribes have their own piece with the county as well, but just looking at the different practices and things that should be done to change the county's any of the county's practices and standards for the home.
Yes, there is work. There's been work with the counties working with the tribes. Hennepin County has the highest number, that's just Hennepin, right? Because it's urban here. But statewide. But the problem is there is still, in my humble opinion, having done with the counties, dealt with them since 2001, a deeply ingrained bias against brown skin, so that their reaction is to remove and make better rather than to keep the kid there and how do we do it safely. So their gut is to pull, and it's really hard to get them to change their mind.
Right.
And part of the I'm just going to share, part of the reason I'm testy is because we had a meeting with the county this week about a contract we have that's working with families, trying to prevent case. And the message we got from Hennepin County is we can unilaterally change our contract whenever we want because we control the money, right? Well, that is not the attitude of an agency or county who really gives a darn about kids and family. That's the attitude of a county that puts the best interests of their budget ahead of their children. And in my attitude, in my experience, that's been the case for a long time. And so good, hardworking social workers on the front don't get supported by the infrastructure because they're worried about the money.
Okay, thank you.
But I'm biased. I'll admit my bias freely. And there was a woman in the back. Yes, right there. Yes.
First, I really appreciate these trainings, so thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Here's my stuff too.
I'm a case manager at St. Stephen's, so also
Yeah?
you're taking over Kateri and going to provide a service there. Yeah, yes. But I recently did the point-in-time count, the quarterly count of people sleeping outside or, in places not meant for human habitation, and spoke with a Native woman who's been, sleeping outside for a few years or continually homeless. But she made a comment about Native women are the only kind of group that statistics aren't kept on. And, it wasn't something I went into with her a lot, but she's like, you can look it up. And I remembered that, made me think about it. And I think hearing you tonight, it gave me kind of a new angle of maybe where she was coming from. And so I don't know if you have any other ideas what she may have been referring to, but, I'm wondering if it is something stemming from the lack of data on missing women and things like that.
I think that individual is kind of referring to the fact that during these counts, there have been some problems in the past where individuals haven't wanted to go into the camps or have felt safety concerns because, part of the problem is some of our community, they're never going to be in the 2 or 4 bedroom house with a 2-car garage and the sub. That's not what they want. They'll never want that, right? I see the group that, I know they'll be back soon, right, that live under the Cedar Avenue Bridge, right? From one perspective, that's horrible. You know, from my perspective, are they getting counted? Are they being shuffled to the side as not good enough victims almost? But the other thing is, I mean, has anybody asked them what they wanted? Like what they need? I mean, maybe a community of tiny houses would be great for them, right? Or maybe a big open space with kind of permanent camping. So, I mean, maybe that would make them happy, right? But most of the systems operate from a model of kind of middle class suburbia as a goal. And so many communities, not just Native, fail and are seen as failures because we can't. What is wrong with you people that you can't get there, right? Or even Little Earth, it happens. We've given you people housing, and look, right? There's another shooting at Little Earth, right? Not recognizing, well, maybe you're trying to push us into a system and a mold that we don't want or fit, and maybe ask us what we'd really like. Right? And one of the things I want to do with the Terry property is have one of the quads shifted into drop-in, so that our workers who are out doing case management one-on-one and outreach, if someone needs to come get a shower, sleep, eat safely, that would be one place they could do it. Two, and diversify the relatives coming in to the program. Anyone else? Yeah, okay. Oh, I'm going to let this lady first with the green, really pretty green shirt and sweater.
So I was somewhat involved in the Capital Art project, and it was really called to my attention how Native women are depicted in the art at the state capitol.
Oh, yeah.
And the need for art that represents the people, especially the indigenous people of the state. And I'm wondering if you have anything you want to speak to regarding that.
It's funny. I was at the Indian Affairs Council meeting when they first brought the issue to the Indian Affairs Council, which meets quarterly, and it's made up, if you don't know this, of all the chairs and leadership of all the tribes. And it's a reporting relationship between the state government and the tribes. So here come these people talking about the art. Melanie Benjamin from Mille Lacs was pretty articulate about her concerns about it being misrepresentative. And then I was there, ironically, to speak about the sex trafficking conference that we were doing down at Mystic Lake in a few months, asking for support from the tribes as far as having them send people to help support it. Not money, I wanted people. And I tied it in. I'm like, when you show an Ojibwe woman on her knees in front of a priest topless, that sends a kind of a message about how current at that time perspectives were about Native women, and maybe getting rid of that art would be a good idea. They didn't, right? They ultimately decided the historic value of the art as art outweighed the experiences of those impacted, right? To me, that's no different than the Gallo art, except that social media took off, and people, the people responsible for that fiasco of a decision recognized what a mistake they made and backed off. They did it, the state never did, right? So our government dug in deeper, whereas the private sector recognized the error and did their best to apologize and get rid of that in a good way. But yeah, art is interesting, right? And I don't know if you've seen it. The former executive director of the Walker has just written a piece kind of talking about the need to not do what she did. And kind of owning that she made a grave error in even bringing that art piece here without understanding the context and how the effect it would have on the Dakota people here. Let me look for it. I'm guessing it was like in the last week or so, right? I mean, I just read it because I've been traveling, and it was during this past week. So I'll find it. I'll find it and have Joe send it out to those who attended. But it's a good article. I feel a little bad that she got fired. Not that bad, but a little. Yes, Melanie.
What would appropriate data and process for collecting data look like for missing Indigenous women, especially because what I understand is from how task force work, they employ or get third-party agencies to do that work. And so what does that look like from, as an Indigenous woman who's interested in this work, what does that look like?
I think the third party will be the law enforcement and those who come in contact and the nonprofits to do that kind of recording. I'm not sure, right? That's the problem. If I serve on the task force, I will be like militant to the fact that all of the individuals on Lake Street are missing somewhere. And so they should be counted as missing Indigenous women, right? That it's and, not missing and murdered, it's missing and murdered, or missing and assumed murdered, right? I mean, it's actually 3 separate categories that we're referring to there, right? So I'm not sure, right? I'm not the expert in policy. I imagine it'll be hard, but I mean, I could do a quick count just from the staff who here work in the community. We could get a pretty quick number just from having a meeting at the Indian Center of everybody from the community. And then forcing the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension to count, track who the race of the victim, and tribal identity if possible too. It'd be nice to know if there's a something there. Anybody else? What time is it? Yeah. So thank you so much for coming. Thank you for asking. Thank you for asking questions, so we didn't all leave all Debbie Downer, right? May 31st, back here. We'll try to have the food on time.